Hello, Chris Bucklow again, returning for one more video, which would be the fourth in this ongoing series, um, delving into and discussing somewhat obscure historical topics. Well, obscure probably to a good deal of people, but maybe to some certain history enthusiasts, history buffs, genealogy enthusiasts, it wouldn't be, but today, and in the interest of time, I'm going to try to be relatively brief and proceed right into the presentation, if you will, because the sun is setting. As some of you who've gotten to know me a bit throughout the past, well, I could say from 2012 onward, when I began, which is quite a while ago, began kind of a Facebook career, if you will, if you can call it that, or providing content social in that platform of social media. Excuse me for swerving a bit, but that I have a bit of interest in, or well, quite a bit of interest in genealogy, and had discovered some interesting things within the 25% of my ancestral background, ethnicity, heritage that's French Canadian. And to, once again, in the interest of time, I'll come right to the point of what I'm going to begin speaking about here and presenting, is that I had found a few things that were, I'll focus on two in particular today that were fairly surprising. I suppose maybe I could have anticipated some of it, or would have thought that that maybe I would find something like that, but not really, though. I think this was still somewhat of a surprise, that there's a phenomenon I was unaware of, called within the French Canadian genealogical circles, or Franco-American, like French Canadian American genealogical circles, phenomenon known as the French Canadian Royal Gateway ancestors. And having discovered that, I learned that in essence that during the 17th century, the 1600s, there were certain colonists, there were certain men and women who had come as colonists from France to New France, which at that time would be Quebec and Montreal, and would later include Detroit, outposts in Illinois, Missouri, the Arkansas post, New Orleans. It all became, French holdings. That there were some people who came, just as they did as well, to the English colonies, which became the 13 colonies. Some colonists arrived who had royal ancestry, in other words, and I found various websites, resources, articles online, and books and so forth, also discussing this. That and there was a particular one or two lists that I had come across that provide kind of substantiation and verification about whether or not certain French colonists to Canada truly had royal ancestry connected to France and the UK. And one of my direct ancestors, who I believe had been a 8 or 9 times great grandmother to mine, I'm probably not going to be pronouncing her surname correctly, but I believe it was Anne Couvent. Her surname was spelled Couvent. And to make a long story quite a bit shorter, as it turned out, there were genealogical researchers who had done quite a bit of work during the past few decades to substantiate, to prove, to validate that she could claim to descent, and was indeed descended from such historical figures as Charlemagne, William the Conqueror, Alfred the Great, who was one of the most famous of the Anglo-Saxon English kings, Barbarossa, Frederick Barbarossa, who was a emperor of the German emperor of the Holy Roman Empire during medieval times, and also that there was a certain ancestor of hers who would have been I can't recall actually whether it was um, he would be an uncle like 25 generations ago to her or to me, or whether he was direct to her and a 25 times like great grand uncle to myself. I can't actually remember, but in any event, in any case, he is, connected to her in one of those ways and connected to me in the other way, and so is, a direct ancestor of both of ours, and that would be that is Edward the Confessor, who was one of the last Anglo-Saxon king of England prior to the Norman conquest. So all these folks I've mentioned, like him and William the Conqueror and Charlemagne, were all the direct ancestors of Anne Couvent, who was once again a female woman, French colonist who would come to New France, to Canada in the 1600s. And I had no idea at all, really, that she was my direct ancestor until just a few years ago, and had even less of a clue, of course, less of a notion growing up, of course, that she was my ancestor, or that she and myself are descended from royal figures like this, because it just wasn't within my just based on my life experiences, and based on what I knew at that point of my family history, that would have been and was the last thing I would have assumed about my background. So so the point of sharing this is that many of you out there who maybe have some French Canadian ancestry in Canada or in the United States, or who live in other parts of the world, you might be able to locate one of these French Canadian royal gateway ancestors in your family tree. And then also and as I said, I don't know if there's like a genealogical society that focuses on these particular women specifically, but there might be. But I know there's a bit of information about them online. And there were two researchers whose surnames were Gagny, I think it's pronounced in French, it's spelled Gagne, and another surname which seemed kind of like Slavic or Polish, like Kokonowski, that these two researchers had worked for quite a while amassing evidence, looking into the primary sources and gathering their documentation that she was indeed Anne Couvent, my direct ancestor. And she's the direct ancestor, of course, of many other people too, that she was indeed descended from all those royal figures. And but again, I don't know if there's genealogical societies per se organized around the subject of these French Canadian royal gateway ancestors. But I do know there is a society, I believe, pretty sure there is. Yeah, actually there is, not just I believe, there is a society or organization in Canada dedicated to another kind of interesting little interesting story that once again that I would not have knew nothing about growing up, and was quite a surprise given what I had heard about my dad's mother's, my paternal grandmother's surname was Schneider, and which was a German last name, and I had heard growing up that even my mother, who's Southern Italian descent and Sicilian and so forth, had said, oh, well, the Schneiders, they had come from, and I think my grandmother herself had said too, well, they came from Alsace-Lorraine to Canada in the late 1800s, and as it turned out, in the interests once again, of time, I'll delve right into it, is that couldn't have been further from the truth is that she was actually descended from a Hessian German mercenary soldier of the American Revolution who had come amongst, I don't know if it was a couple to few thousand or if it was several hundred, I cannot remember at the moment. Hessian German mercenaries, very much like the ones who had come to, let's say, that fought at the Battle of Trenton in New Jersey, but they had been sent to the area just outside of Montreal, which was being administered by Great Britain at that time, by England, because the English had won the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, and they were in control of British North America at that time, which was formerly New France and Canada. And so these Hessian German mercenaries were posted to guard Canada against the American rebels. You know, during the 13 colonies, during the American Revolution. And one of them was my grandmother and my own direct ancestor, whose name was Johann Schneider, and he was a Lutheran who had been born and raised. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I'm not a German language scholar. It was Bad Soden, Saarmünster, Hesse, Germany, and that's where my research revealed that's where he came from. And he had served as a Jaeger or rifleman or marksman in Kreutzbergs or Kreutzborgs. The spelling kind of lends itself to either of those pronunciations. Jaeger Corps, Kreutzbergs, Jaeger Corps, and I do know he was involved in some excursions into New York State, and part of the regiment had been at the Battle of the Siege of Fort Stanwix and the Battle of Oriskany in New York State. And excuse me. And so he in essence turned out to, research had revealed just a few years ago, in stark contrast to what I had imagined or what I had heard as a boy in like the late 1980s, early to early 1990s, that he had been a German from Alsace-Lorraine who had come, which is an area which has both French and German culture along the borders of the countries of Germany and France, but that instead he was a true German from Hesse, Germany, the area of Germany known as Hesse, and was a Hessian, hence the name. And he's my 5 times great grandfather. And there was a society and there's a website for the descendants of these few hundred, I believe it was, Hessian Jaeger riflemen who opted to stay in British North America and Canada following their service in the American Revolutionary War, and the descendants of which, of course, are continuing to live in Canada and in the United States. And so amongst the people of Quebecois, French Canadian descent in Canada and the United States, when folks of that background, if some of whom sometimes possess German surnames, like my grandmother Margaret's, even though she was, of primarily French Canadian descent, some such folks, when they possess German surnames, are many times are descended from these Hessian soldiers. And there was a society, as I said, which is kind of an interesting little, and I'm probably not pronouncing the word correctly, niche or niche, kind of niche or niche of history. It was a very interesting, once again, fascinating, little known side story, which, pardon some of my expressions, it's becoming a bit nippy out here once again, and I'm in a park here in Lake Forest, California, amongst these trees that I had never seen growing up in Massachusetts, but they are like eucalyptus trees that were brought here to Southern California from Australia, I believe, during the gold rush, and I'm amidst like a grove of them here, or maybe not quite a grove, but a collection of them, standing in a clearing amongst them here, with nobody around. Once again, I thought, although it might seem odd to some of my viewership, an odd location to be making a presentation like this, it actually works. It suits my purposes pretty well to have kind of, privacy, to delve into this kind of lecture, if you will. Although I'm probably not entitled to call it such, because I'm certainly not a professor, but more like an armchair historian, although I do have a degree in history from the University of New Hampshire. I was part of the Salisbury, Massachusetts Historical Society, part of a few different living history groups back in New England, the 5th New Hampshire Volunteer Regiment Reenactment Group, Living History Group from New Hampshire, which some of you in the living history community back east would know about, and also the Lawrence Civil War Memorial Guard, who portray the 6th Massachusetts Volunteer Militia of the Baltimore riot fame, the opening of the American Civil War, the Minutemen of '61, and also I had briefly taken part in living histories with the 20th Maine Company B in from the mid-coast of Maine, and of course they represent the 20th Maine that had served at the action at Little Round Top under Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. But anyway, be that as it may, those are some of my experiences. But I can't call myself a professor. But anyway, but returning to and concluding my presentation for today, or for this evening, kind of an interesting little stories as far as there is a segment of the Quebecois, and French Canadian and French Canadian Franco-American population that are descended from these Hessian soldiers, just as certain people in the United States of a non-French Canadian background are too. I remember even the show Who Do You Think You Are, the genealogy show, that television show that even like Rob Lowe, the actor, had found out that he's descended from a Hessian soldier who had served at the Battle of Trenton during the American Revolution. So my story, my family's very similar, in that this ancestor of ours, he had served in little excursions into New York State, and he guarded Canada against the Americans during the American Revolution. So he was a Hessian of the American Revolution, just as Rob Lowe's ancestor was. And so, it's been fascinating, and it's been intriguing, and these stories have kind of drawn me in. And I know some of you who've gotten to know me a bit through Facebook have seen that I share maybe perhaps an inordinate amount of it, which be that as it may, that it has become, that proves it has, but shows, of course, that it has become quite intriguing to me. And it's just one of those situations where I just learned one more bit of information, and that led me on into certain other avenues and certain other paths in genealogy, and discovering more and more and more. And so it's just been endlessly fascinating, and I apologize for using that word, overusing that word ad nauseum, fascinating, but it truly has been. And and there is one last story aside from the Hessian descent of many French Canadian people, and the royal ancestry of French Canadian people. And once again, it's royal ancestry that's not only French royal ancestry, it's English royal ancestry. So my grandmother and myself, for instance, are descended from some of the same royal figures that the royal family in King Charles is descended from. Charlemagne, Alfred the Great, William the Conqueror, Edward the Confessor are my ancestors, as they are his. But but I'm certainly not. I am not at all the type of person who needs to, or wants, or has a inclination to boast about such things. And that's not even remotely the purpose of why I'm sharing it. I'm just sharing it for, just as to kind of maybe once again to pique the interest and inspire others to investigate their own genealogy, because just as like the show Finding Your Roots has proved on PBS, you never know what you might that'd be quite surprised what you might find. And but the last story is, of course, some of you might have seen the episode of the show Finding Your Roots where the actor of the series Law and Order, Christopher Maloney, had discovered that he had Puritan English New England roots found within the French Canadian part of his family tree. And he's also, of course, part Italian, as I am too, so he's got similar ancestry to mine of French Canadian and Italian. And I had found one of these stories. There was one such story within the French Canadian portion of my family tree, where there was an English Puritan. Well, his family were Quakers and Puritans, and they had lived in the area of Kittery and Berwick, Maine, which some people out there in the world may not have heard of before. But Kittery, Maine is known, pretty famous for the Kittery Trading Post, which is a big outdoor. It's outdoor themed, and it's like an outlet, somewhat like LL Bean, like that. And so my Quaker and Puritan ancestor's name was Richard Nason, and he had been captured by the French Canadian militiamen and the Abenaki Native American allies during King William's War in the late 1680s, brought to Canada, to New France by them, and he was sold to a French merchant, and later became a part of that French merchant's family and married the French merchant's daughter, and thereby entered my lineage and my bloodline. And through him, which is kind of interesting because this is one of the more just completely contradictory, odd, and I don't use this word to inject controversy into this, but twisted aspects of history that growing up in New England, and it's happened to me, and I've experienced it in other parts of the country too, quite a bit of bigotry because of being Southern Italian descent, my surname, my phenotype and stuff. So I certainly didn't imagine that I had any ancestry at all, even though what I have found is this is only one line, but it's a very, very well documented line that I've fully substantiated and found a lot of supporting primary evidence for, is that this ancestor of mine, Richard Nason, his grandparents, two of his grandparents and then one of his granduncles were passengers within something that was known as the Winthrop Fleet, which was the fleet of ships that Governor John Winthrop led to, who would later become Governor John Winthrop of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so these direct ancestors of mine were some of the founding colonists of Boston, which that was a revelation to me, having primarily viewed myself as even though having the French Canadian ancestry, I really had primarily viewed myself as an Italian American, given my experiences and so forth. So fascinating stuff. So once again, you never know what you might end up finding if you so choose to dig into your family's background and ancestry and dig into the records, although it does take quite a bit of time, and I've used a number of different websites and resources such as Wikitree, Ancestry.com, FamilySearch.org. There's one, GENI.com, and then also there's a French-Canadian genealogical database that I've used titled nosorigines.com, and many other resources too, to uncover all this. But well, that will just about conclude it for tonight, or for this evening. Apologize once again if the lighting has affected the quality of this video, but that's about it. And I will speak with all of you at some point in the future. All right, have a good evening.